If you're an artist or a creative in any capacity and you have even an ounce of self-awareness, I'm sure you relate a little bit to this meme. Yes, it can feel incredibly unproductive, weird, strange, tone deaf, however you want to say it, to let people know that the link to your new painting drop is in your bio while the world sometimes literally is on fire, or to let people know that commissions are open while our political state is devolving into right-wing fascism. Why do artists still get up and do and contribute? And even though the work that you're doing can feel really superficial compared to everything going on, I have always had an inkling in my gut that it's important for artists to make art. I think sometimes for me, it's easier to look abstractly at other artists and say that what you're doing is important. And I don't always extend that to myself. And it's out of this sort of dissonance and discomfort, and again, like an ounce of social awareness, that I found out, I searched for books on this topic, and I stumbled upon a book called Reclaiming Art in the Age of Artifice by JF Martel. And in this video, I'm going to paint a little moment from my downtown. I live in Austin. It's the Paramount Theater and the State Building during Pride, so there's lovely little rainbows in there. And I'm going to talk about some of the points in this book. I'm going to go through a little bit of a chapter by chapter synopsis and my thoughts. And I can't recommend this book enough. I will say I have shared this with some of my friends, and I've gotten the reviews back since. And I will say the one challenging part of this book to keep in mind is that there is an entire chapter dedicated to cleaving, to separating out art versus artifice. Artifice is anything that like kind of looks like art. So think advertising, certain movies, propaganda, visual things that are man-made that are meant to make you go and buy something or believe something, right? It gets messy. It's the part of the book that I probably agree with the least. It's chapter 2. He has to sort of make a case for there's in and there's out. I think even if you vehemently disagree with the way he separates the art versus artifice, I still think you can get a lot out of the book. And I will say it's a little dense. The book will leave you sort of looking at your dictionary from time to time, but it's short, and I would say just know that I love reading. I love literature even, and I had to wade through it a little bit slowly. So just heads up. But if you are interested in hearing my thoughts, if you're wanting a fuller review as to whether you should read the book, then let's jump into the video. The introduction is written by Donna Tartt, who wrote The Goldfinch, and I think that book is the most relevant to this because the last couple chapters really speak to the importance of art. And I will say personally, I read these kind of one after each other, and it felt like a beautiful extension of the end of The Goldfinch. But her foreword to this book is really written like a pep talk for the artist during today's time. In fact, she even goes on to mention things like AI and its role in art. And she doesn't do this in this sort of oracle predicting the future despair moment, but rather she really hypes up the importance of art and why you should persevere and why it's important. And I will say my favorite takeaway was from a quote from Groucho Marx, where he says, reality really stinks, but it's the only decent place to get a meal, which I'm paraphrasing. But the context of that is that as artists, so much of what we do and how we see the world and how we engage and the reason why we make something and what we make is so not based in reality. In fact, this if you've told someone who's a little more business-minded, oh, I'm an artist. And they're like, oh, this one thing is really trendy. Have you thought about making those and selling them on Etsy? And you can respect that they're just trying to help and being kind, but you're like, no, dude, no. But I think the quote basically says, like, if you need to eat, like, which all of us do, and you aren't sitting on, some tremendous fortune, you still have to in some way engage with reality by virtue of finding a way to sell your art or having another job to support your art. And I think that that's really what this book is spoken to. And I will say the book's tough. It's written a little bit dense is my biggest, I think, the detractor from it, which most art text kind of is, unfortunately. And I will say the book kind of leaves you, while it's encouraging and validating in some ways, you're kind of left with this epiphany of like, oh, art making and art itself doesn't actually fit well into the world, and certainly not this current time of hyper-capitalist, moment. And yet it's still worth making. And obviously, if somebody could write how to bridge those two things seamlessly, it would be a bestseller, and, we wouldn't need this book. But that's something we all have to individually sift through. And I think I still found it incredibly validating. And the introduction in particular was great. Now, the first chapter starts as you would expect in a book like this, which is, okay, well, let's define art. And I will say, spoiler, he doesn't really fully define it. And I would say that my thought is that it is kind of indefinable. But he says basically it transcends human capacity. And I actually tend to agree with this. I had a podcast called History of Creativity where it really wasn't up until the last 100, 200-ish years at most, where we thought of creativity as something that could source from humans. Like the idea of sort of the male creative genius is all relatively new and relatively singular to the West even. And the idea for most of human history is that creativity can kind of flow through us. We could be conduits of it, but that the source was this larger genius that extended outside of us, whether you call that nature, genius, or in a lot of the West's history, God. And regardless, humans could not be the source material for that, which I think is very important when it comes to defining art. In fact, one quote he says is, "Art is mysterious because its purpose is unknown and its effect always exceeds the ends we put it to." That is to say, it doesn't really fit neatly into any one box. And the last thing I'll say on this chapter is he sort of cites the Chauvet cave paintings in southern France, which were made about 30,000 years ago. And what's, I think, important about that is because this part of humanity and these people specifically were very much subsistence living. That is to say that unlike other times in history where we had this agricultural revolution and we had this leisure class and people could basically dilly-dally without draining the whole society's resources, people still valued art making, right? And we think of it nowadays as, art making feels frivolous and again could be its own distinct conversation about that. But, half the population thinks that art is degenerate. And if it doesn't uphold current ideals of beauty standards and propaganda and really support a very strict hegemony, then it's degenerate. And then you have the other half of people, which I think are responding to sort of this decline into fascism by saying all hands on deck, everyone needs to help. And I get that. And so from both sides as an artist, painting a scenic picture of your, favorite park can feel kind of silly, but I think Martel saying like we've always made art and it's important is good. And I will say my personal thought on it is you can walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. You can, support and write your congressman and, picket at your local ICE detention center and also make pink abstract paintings if you would like, that they're both part of being human. Chapter 2 is by far the most divisive chapter because if chapter 1 says define what art is and the answer is you really can't, it's bigger than us, then chapter 2 tries to define artifice. And he basically says artifice looks like art, but it isn't. And, he kind of goes after Marvel movies and most of advertising and, a lot of entertainment and propaganda and things like that. And some of those things might feel obvious, but at the same time, a lot of us really love things that he might call artifice. And we found a lot of art in them, which is where I would direct you to the part of the chapter where he says, listen, art can hide within artifice. Think of it this way. Like if a Disney executive says, hey, we're going to make our 5th iteration of this wildly successful kids movie that started in 1996 to try to make money, there can still be writers and artists on that team who, despite having to make something that is really made without the intention of art, but money making at its forefront, they can still sow into that little seeds of art and someone can pick up on that and it can mean something to them. Another, point he's says in this chapter is that Avatar by James Cameron, he sort of says is for him an example of clear artifice. Now, a lot of people like that movie. The visuals are beautiful, but because the ending is so cookie cutter, spoon fed, cut and dry, which is humans bad, nature good, which we can agree with to some extent, but because it's already a trope, because it already feels like it's been fleshed out, and because there's not really room for interpretation, he says that basically falls into propaganda, or at the very least, rehashing an already hashed out trope. The next chapter on the note of beauty is about beauty. And I think this is really important to remember because when I was in art school, we were instructed not to use beauty in our critiques. The thing is, beauty is for a lay person, so someone who hasn't had the formal arts education, usually means I like to look at it, or it's like good looking, or it follows agreed upon norms around what looks good, and I'm giving you a compliment. And within art, beauty is kind of this bigger conversation. Like I think of it like trying to pull a weed and ends up having like huge roots. You're like, I was just trying to say it looks good. But, as this chapter I think lays out really well, is that starting with Kant and sort of this classical education, at least within the Western canon, beauty has this deeper meaning of, is there an innate beauty that's natural to something, or is it in the eye of the beholder? And that's kind of, again, this could be a longer conversation, but he fleshes out a lot of the theories that Kant lays out. So he says, for Kant, modern rationalism, beauty really is in the eye of the beholder. But for Aquinas, Joyce, and Wilde, it's the other way around. That beauty exists as a fundamental reality that we, as the beholder, can come to witness through something that is larger than us. And he sort of defines it really succinctly of what he believes beauty is. But all that to say, I think when you're trying to identify art and artifice, it's important to throw out what most people go to first. Well, art is beautiful, but we can obviously see through movies like Avatar that beautiful things can still be artifice. Chapter 4, to me, is one of the more interesting chapters. It's called Signs and Symbols. And just a real quick disclaimer, what's the difference between sign and symbol? Symbols are larger, they're more abstract, and signs are more clear and direct. A stop sign is a sign, the letter A is a sign, and it's very, very directly tied to something. In fact, Martel says that symbols are lenses for observing the imaginal world beyond the range of normal awareness, even though they continue to work as signs on a mundane level. Take, for example, the moon. The moon can mean nighttime very clearly. The moon is the sign that the sun has gone down, and we have this little orbiting circle around us, and that night is here. That's one of its more clear symbols, right? On children's toys, we have sun is day and moon is night. But more deeply, it can mean nighttime, but it can also mean your relationship with your mother, fertility. It has, the moon has so many different meanings to it, right? It can tie into mythological stories and narratives. In fact, one of my favorite books is a Titian book called Signs and Symbols. And you flip through and there's so much meaning. I will say this chapter to me is the biggest refuting the it's not that deep crowd. That is to say that everything actually has symbolic meaning. And part of what it is to be an artist is to be aware of it. Whether or not you use it, you intend it, whatever, is to understand that everything has depth. If someone made a video on how to make bean soup and someone says they're actually pro-imperialist and you don't have to agree with their conclusion or change what you do, but maybe they're revealing to you a deeper meaning of it. That's a really poor example, but the idea being that part of why we resist the it's not that deep crowd is because we think that it means that we automatically have to change what we're doing to fit someone else's interpretation, when in reality, it's to have an awareness and use your own discernment as an artist or as a participant of art to know when and where and how to engage those deeper meanings. In fact, a really good anecdote from this chapter was a short story about an elderly couple whose son went into a mental institution because he kept reading signs and symbols into everything. And it was so ominous because the story had all these signs and symbols and then it ultimately meant nothing. And you as the reader sort of mimicked the over-reading into everything that the main character had. And I thought that was really astute. Chapter 5 is Rift and Prophecy. And the idea is that classic works of art have two components which allow them to transcend the artist's intention. A rift is a strange occurrence or unexplainable feature of artwork that elevates its meaning beyond the intended. And a prophecy is a work's ability to speak truth into unknowable phenomenon or to occur after the creation. And this chapter to me was really especially once you get past the first few, they're so good. But he basically says and gives example of when art has basically spoke something to existence. And I know I'm from the Midwest. I'm not supposed to be woo-woo, but the more I do art, the more I have seen this in my own work, that you create something and that it inspires a trend or that other people sort of at the same time were thinking of it. In fact, I would say that this book's accompanying book would be Big Magic. It feels like it has a lot of similar themes. In fact, at one point, Martel says, "We live at a highly complex time that no expert and analyst could have predicted. That is to say, of course, that no one could have seen the scope of social media or what it is. And certain works of art, however, discern the potentialities that have actualized themselves long before they became evident, sometimes in ways that the creators could not have intended. In fact, he goes on to talk about Francis Bacon's paintings of humiliated and tortured figures as an example of work that foresaw the dark depths and social media landscape. Another example of this that I would say is Andy Warhol's quote about everyone will one day have their 15 minutes of fame. And I think that everyone can interpret that a little bit different, whether he means that everyone would have truly, like, that everyone's fame could only ever last 15 minutes because of like the attention economy, or that he was saying that as media, he noted that people are interested in people. You know, one of the things he did during the factory when he was in New York was that he was, wealthy and had all these connections, and he would hire film crews to just film him and his friends goofing around. And he was surprised how little formal movie making had to go into it for people to be interested. And I like to interpret his quote about 15 minutes of fame, meaning rather that all of us have something interesting to us, and that eventually there would be a time when we learned how to take that. Of course, yeah, we did through social media. We're all able to go viral in our pockets and be famous. And whether or not that's good or bad, I think the fact that Warhol sort of was born to a poor immigrant family, the fact that he was queer and struggled with illnesses, I think allowed him to see a layer of humanity that saw that everyone wanted something that at one point a very, very exclusive group of people could only have. And I think he knew that that was going to change in scale, that wanting to be seen and be famous and be actualized wasn't just the natural, for only a few people, wasn't just the natural order of things, but rather a byproduct of our system being so stratified among class and other hierarchies. Chapter 6, Ideology, Art, and Politics. In this chapter, art and politics must coexist as they influence each other. Artistic expression emanating from the real, i.e. as rift and prophecy, inspires and challenges ideology. Martel argues that art is innately apolitical because it doesn't have the motivations of influence. And I will say this chapter too had a couple people in my mentorship group a little up in arms, because I think unfortunately the way I took it is because, a lot of people say, well, if you're making art about nature because you're trying to stop a company from building a pipeline through indigenous land, that art is political. And I would actually say that politics have just permeated to all of society. I made a video that went pretty viral in which I said that all art is political. It may not be made with political intentions, but that one could use the lens of everything being affected by politics to look at everything. And I think some people misinterpreted politics as partisanship. So not everything is necessarily Democrats and Republicans, of course, but everything is affected by policy because policy is so expansive. In this chapter, he also cites Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, but he was sort of notoriously a misogynist. Like, he was not this great pro-woman person, and yet he wrote this protagonist in Madame Bovary as a very progressive feminist icon, who really pushed norms and humanized her, and some have sort of attributed to larger feminist movements. So can bad people make good art? I think it goes back to the do you separate the art from the artist conversation, which I do think is also tricky. I think that, for what it's worth, my opinion is when the artist is still alive and profiting, that you can be a little more do not support. It's harder to, I think, do that, support the art, support the artist sort of line. But I think once, the act of consuming the art becomes distance from perpetuating the person's ability to do harm, I think it becomes a little bit more nuanced. Also, what I liked about this chapter is he highlights the importance of play as opposed to work, and that, art should have a dilly-dallying sort of quality to it. In fact, at one point he says, the spirit of work is the home of the ego, the part of us that evolved to survive and thrive. And one of the conditions of true artistic creation seems to be the ability to move from this frame of mind into the spirit of play. As many artists have said in various ways, the trick is always to forget everything and to create just for the sake of creating. And again, this really feeds back to my initial love of Groucho Marx's, reality stinks, but it's the only place to get a lunch. I think linking work and art making too closely without putting sort of impediments in between there can be really tricky. Chapter 7 is postmortem. In this chapter, he argues that the sheer volume of images and objects that we call art tempts us to dismiss art's significance. That is to say, we see a lot of things that look like art, and so maybe we don't care about art. However, he says, differentiating between art and artifice is actually a very critical and crucial way of freeing yourself from the manipulative and limiting world we exist in. In fact, at one point he says, great works of art are like inexhaustible springs originating from a place beyond our little world of man. They reconnect us with a reality too vast for the rational mind to comprehend. And he basically warns against technology's limiting power and its capacity to, in one way or another, destroy humanity. Art has the ability to provide guidance, but we have to wake up and receive it. And I think the last chapter, for me, really signifies the importance of the book. I recommend this book to artists, and I think there's a lot of really nutritious food in there for an artist to go through. But I would say if you like art, you've been an art student, you dilly-dally with art a little bit, but maybe you're hesitant to call yourself an artist, I would really emphasize the importance of developing what we might call media literacy, or the ability to distinguish what are the motivations, why was this created, in the spirit of becoming someone who's harder to manipulate in a world full of visuals. And especially as AI begins to tempt us, I think that that's one of the most important things that we can do. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed watching this come together and hearing my thoughts. As always, I'm interested to hear what you guys think about this book. And as an added note, if you're still here, one thing I want to do more with this channel is do more basically like book review type content. I am an avid reader, and I've been really hitting the theory a little bit harder. I use theory lightly here, but for example, I would really like to read Picture of Dorian Gray next. I also really want to give a whole video to one of my favorite books, which is Chromophobia by David Batchelor. It talks about how color is often politicized. So if any of those things sound interesting, then you're in luck, because that's the programming for the foreseeable future. And I will talk to you guys in next week's video.